All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Andrea Webster. I'm the Implementation Manager at IU's Environmental Resilience Institute, reporting to you from my house for our webinar this month. I'd like to welcome you to the topic for today, which is effectively communicating with the public during a crisis. So this is certainly a timely topic, and we have some really fabulous speakers for you today. Before you get started, I want to let you all know that you are all muted. But we encourage you to enter questions in the chat box as the webinar occurs. And you can do that by hovering your mouse over the screen, and you'll see the chat option pop up in an icon bar, either at the top or the bottom of your screen. We will try to hold most of our questions till the end, but we will certainly, if you have an urgent or clarifying question, we may interrupt the speaker and have them clarify that for us. I will be live tweeting the webinar today, so if you'd like to follow along on Twitter and share your thoughts and interests on that thread, you're welcome to do so. We'll be tweeting from @preparedforchange, which is the Environmental Resilience Institute's Twitter handle. And finally, I am very pleased to introduce the director of the Environmental Resilience Institute, Janet McCabe, who will be our moderator today.
Well, hi, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us. We're really pleased to have you. Today, we have two very talented and experienced individuals, Jennifer Wagner and Allison Barber, who are going to share strategies about communicating through a crisis. We realized that with the pandemic going on, we needed to adjust our topics for our webinars for the next couple months anyway, to be relevant to that topic. And so we hope that you will find this to be useful. In particular, I've been thinking about the fact that this is flood season in Indiana, and are we prepared to handle the kinds of rescue and response actions that we need during flood season when we're also physically distancing and quarantining and having to behave very differently. And it actually led me to reach out to the Indiana Red Cross and learn that they're way thinking about this and have already started planning for handling those kinds of operations differently under this situation. So lots of people are thinking about this. We work so closely with Indiana cities and towns, and we know that the pressure is really on local governments right now. To be responsive and to be communicating with their residents. And so we hope that this program is useful to you. Just quickly for anybody who may not have been on an ERI podcast or webinar before, we exist at the Indiana University Bloomington campus physically, but we're statewide. One of the things that we do is develop resources for local governments, but they're available to anybody widely, to try to help cities and towns and communities in Indiana be more resilient in the face of environmental and climate change. That includes this webinar and tools like the Hoosier Resilience Index and the Environmental Resilience Institute Toolkit, which I commend to you if you haven't looked at them. We also do a lot of communication through the media school and the Institute. We have a podcast called In This Climate that might come in handy when you're taking your 7th dog walk of the day. That seems to be what I'm doing now all the time when I'm not working, is walking my dog. And he still manages to pee in the house sometimes, so go figure on that. But there are lots of interesting topics, many of which are highly relevant today, or at least diverting or comforting to listen to. In addition, we support the Indiana Environmental Reporter, which reports out on Indiana and beyond environmental, climate change, public health stories, and you might find stories of interest there. Anybody's free to run those stories as long as you attribute them to the Indiana Environmental Reporter. We want you to make sure you know what our upcoming webinars are. In May, we were going to be talking about something else, but now we're going to be talking about what are the connections between communicable diseases like coronavirus and environmental change. We'll have experts on to talk about that. A lot of people are thinking about that. There clearly are connections. And so it's good to have a time to talk about those. In June, we'll be talking about the economic value of preparedness preparedness and resilience. This is a question that we get from local government staff all the time, is how do we put a monetary value on these activities that will make us more resilient for something that may or may not happen a number of years into the future, and because that's not necessarily consistent with the way our budgeting systems are set up. So I hope you will join us for that. And then in July, just when it's getting hot, we will have a program on managing extreme heat, and I hope you will join us for that. Just as a reminder, we will have a recording of today's webinar available on our ERI website, and we will send out to you a link for that, along with any follow-up resources that we think might be helpful with you. Feel free to pass word of this webinar along if you find it useful. We're thrilled to have people watching it. I want to thank our sponsors and co-hosts, the Accelerate Indiana Municipalities and the Association of Indiana Counties, two organizations that provide support, education, and all kinds of assistance to local governments across Indiana. We also have two other organizations that we'd like to thank, the Indiana Public Health Association and Health by Design, both organizations who are committed to improving public health and quality of life all across the state of Indiana. So we had quite a few people register for today. I'll acknowledge that this is not the only place to go for advice about how to communicate in a crisis. There's lots of resources being provided. I think personally, you can't hear these messages too much, and every expert that you hear them from gives a bit of different perspective, advice, or importantly, their own personal experiences, which I think is often the best way to learn how to do things, is to hear about the good things and the not so good things that other people have experienced and how they handled them. So thank you all for joining us. I'm going to introduce both our speakers now, and then I'm going to hand it over to Allison first, and then she'll hand it to Jennifer, and then we will have questions at the end. Please do feel free to put your questions into the chat box when you think of them, so you don't have to try to remember them to the end and then be distracted and not be able to pay attention. Jennifer Wagner is a former Indianapolis Star reporter. She served as communications director for the Indiana Criminal Justice Institute and deputy director of public affairs for the National Nuclear Security Administration, which oversees the nation's nuclear weapons stockpile. There's a recipe for crisis communication right there. She also served for several years as spokesperson for the Indiana Democratic Party and has worked on several issue-based and political campaigns. She graduated from Park Tudor School here in Indianapolis, has a bachelor's degree in journalism from the IU Media School, yay, and a JD from the Indiana University School of Law in Indianapolis, where I'm on the faculty. So I'm always pleased to see successful graduates of McKinney. Dr. Allison Barber has had a career filled with communications experience, as you will hear. The first one that she mentions is as a grade school teacher, and we know how important communication is as a grade school teacher, but also as a communications strategist in the White House, at the U.S. Department of Defense, and as the first chancellor and chief fundraiser for the Western Governors University in Indiana, and now as the president and COO of the Indiana Fever, which, talk about a fun-sounding job, except maybe not exactly at this moment. I live 2 blocks from Tamika Catching's tea shop in Indianapolis, and it's always fun to see her there. She has a PhD in leadership from Tennessee Temple University. She's the recipient of the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service, awarded by Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, and was recognized as a woman of influence by the Indianapolis Business Journal. In March 2019, she was presented with Indiana's highest honor, the Sagamore of the Wabash recognition, presented by Governor Eric Holcomb. You have to be a pretty special person to receive a Sagamore of the Wabash, she certainly deserved it. She is state lead volunteer for the American Red Cross. I want people to understand just how critical a position that is. The American Red Cross is an organization that very much depends on its volunteers. It's all about its volunteers, and they integrate their volunteers into the running of the organization. So to say state lead volunteer is like saying she's the other CEO of the Indiana Red Cross representing the volunteer corps. So we're thrilled to have both of these impressive people with us. And I will turn it over to Allison and invite her to share her screen.
Thank you so much, Janet, and thanks for having me. And thanks to all of you who have joined in today. This is a really important topic and so timely. So Janet, congrats to you and your group for putting this together today and giving us a chance to be. Let's see, can you hear me now? I'll just make sure that's working.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today and to be joined with Jennifer and the rest of the group. I know some people are calling in, maybe not on video screen. So I've got a couple of slides I'll share with you, but walk you through those too. You know, as Janet mentioned, I've had an interesting career with some opportunities for crisis communication. Thankfully, as a first grade school teacher, there wasn't a lot of crisis. The closest thing to that was a field trip, and your goal was to leave with 21 kids to the museum, come back with 21 kids, and they had to be the same 21 kids. So that was our highest risk as a first grade school teacher. But throughout my career, there have been many opportunities for me to learn and develop a strategy around how we deal with crisis in the area of communication. I would tell you that I think about the crises in two areas. One is self-imposed and one is natural disaster. And I think it's important to distinguish between those two types of crises. We could deep dive and come up with lots of different examples, but so I would say that the crises of a self-imposed, if you're watching the news, you'll see that the acting Secretary of the Navy relieved the captain of the Theodore Roosevelt. That didn't go so well. The captain of the Roosevelt issued a letter, then he got relieved, and then just recently the Secretary of the Navy resigned. And so that's a lot of crisis communication that is wrapped around a scenario like that. And I would tell you that those are self-imposed crises, which are really hard because they're usually represent a breach of trust and a degradation of credibility. And so in crisis communication, if you've lost trust, it's hard to have people hear what you're trying to share and what you're trying to, the needle you're trying to move. So we're not going to deal with that today. We're going to talk a little bit about what I would call the natural disasters, things that happen, no fault of anyone, but we're right in the thick of it. And how do we deal with it as communicators, and what kind of strategies do we put together? And I've developed a three-pronged strategy. You know, when I went to work at the Pentagon early on, our communication strategies were around issues like missile defense and base closures, different types of metrics for success within the behaviors and training of the military members. So none of these things were crisis, all critical, but not crisis. Although if you would imagine when you have a building filled with a lot of military officers, they can sometimes treat everything like a crisis, even though it's critical. One day I was in my office and a colonel in the Army came flying into my office, and he was just madder than mad because a staff person had submitted a memo and it was in 12-point font and it was supposed to be in 13-point font. And the colonel said, I remember it like it was yesterday, this colonel, I mean, his red face, and he was so mad. And he said, I'm going to roll in hot on this memo. And in that moment, I thought, oh boy, this is not critical. It's not a crisis, it's not critical, but his behavior made it seem like it was both. So there was a lot of that self-imposed crisis mentality within the Pentagon based on individuals. But then when 9/11 happened, boy, that changed everybody's behavior because we were right in the middle of the biggest crisis, and communication was key. So how do we how do we transition immediately, like a crisis makes you do? You know, this is one thing about a crisis. It gives you immediate focus and specific purpose. Just everybody aligns behind the purpose if you handle it the right way and if you put together a good, strong strategy. And so that's where we found ourselves at the Pentagon of saying, okay, overnight we transitioned to a crisis communication team that had to be strategic and thoughtful and effective and adapting every hour on what was changing. And so that's really where I designed what I would say is the strategy that has applied to most of what I've done since those days. And let me see if you can, let me do a quick check. Can you see that screen?
Yes, we can.
All right, great, thank you. The voice of God, thank you. So the three-pronged strategy is this, and it is the, let me see if I can advance my slide now. It will be tricky. So if you're listening in, there are 3 C's that have driven every crisis communication program I've put together, and I'll unpack those as we go along. But the 3 C's are as follows. You have to be coordinated, consistent, and compassionate. Coordinated, consistent, and compassionate. Coordinated across every department. So when you're in the midst of a crisis, you have to figure out who are your audiences, what are your themes, what are your messages, what are your audiences, and what are your outlets to get to your audiences. All of these things have to be coordinated. We've done it, we do it in every crisis. If we do it well, then what you garner are force multipliers that have touch points into communities that you alone will not have. And so what I have here, I've kept this forever. We called it the bubble chart at the Pentagon. It's and I'll show this to you in just a minute. This is what I'm talking about is under coordination. How do you identify your themes, your messages, your spokespeople, and your audiences? Now, if you've written a strategic communication plan, none of that seems new. This is how we put together every PR campaign, marketing campaigns. That's not new. What is new in a crisis, though, is how you identify who your spokespeople are, because it's critical as the fact that they will carry a message that people will hear differently than a different spokesperson. So this is the bubble chart I was sharing. If you're just calling in, I won't read the whole thing to you. I've kept it forever because after 9/11, we said, what are our main messages? We had 3: recruit and retain. We have to have good military members to serve in the military. We have to have more that will join the military. It's a transformation. This is a new way of dealing with in battle. It's an unconventional war. It was economic, diplomatic, military. All of these things were important for us to identify early on. We did this chart early on because we knew if we had to get communication across, we had to be able to bucket it in a way that we could have spokespeople speaking to the value and the importance of each message to an audience that would hear it. So that's how we designed the strategy, and I still do it today. I have bubble charts in every job I've worked at. And when you're in crisis, it's incredibly important because there's so much communication happening that if you don't really drill into the key messages, then what you'll have is just mission creep in your crisis communication plan. So it's a matter of us. We identified in this particular situation after 9/11, we identified our 3 themes, and then we had to figure out who we're going to share that message with. Who were the force multipliers? Oh, they were education leaders, they were union leaders, business leaders, unconventional audiences. We couldn't just rely on one outlet. Then we had to decide on who was the spokesperson. Well, if you can remember back in the day, Secretary Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense. He was very credible in that moment, and he would host the press conferences. When we would have someone else host the press conference, the media didn't cover it. So as communicators, we had to decide what the trade-off was. Do we have Secretary Rumsfeld do the briefing so we get the coverage that we need to advance the cause at the risk of overexposure of Secretary Rumsfeld? And so that's part of the key in strategy too, is who's your spokesperson. And if you overexpose them, then they become dull in the message and it falls deaf on people's ears. And so I'm not quite sure we got that right. I'm not sure that we would do it the same way if we had to do it over again. But in the moment, that's how we moved forward with that first C of coordination across all the departments, across all of the cabinet secretaries. Everybody was on message during the crisis so that it made sure that we were communicating what was important to the nation at the time. Well, the second C, so that's coordination. You have to be creative in how you coordinate too, especially today, because there are so many spokespeople, influencers that can help educate your audience in a way that you might not be able to. And that's where self-awareness is so key. I'm reading the book called Raise Your Game. It's a book written for coaches and players. But the first chapter talks about being self-aware. Sometimes you have to be aware enough to say you have talked so much to your audience, they don't hear you anymore. Or maybe you're not as credible and to that audience, so who would be? It's critical that you identify and coordinate with the right spoke people. The second C is consistent. Boy, we have seen this play out beautifully in this coronavirus situation in our state of Indiana, in my opinion, is that you've watched the governor go to briefings every day at 2:30. There's a consistency. And again, it's important. I've got 3 photos here. You've got the governor at the podium flanked by doctors. Then you have the governor sitting at his desk all by himself. You have the governor doing a briefing all with just 2 people next to him. So he's identified, as this crisis has evolved, he's had to adapt his communication style. So, but it's the consistency. And here's where I think so many communicators and leaders err, is they say, well, we've already said that. We've already talked about social distancing. How many times do we have to talk about social distancing? Well, as many of you know, people will say, oh, the magic number is 7 times. You've got to say it 7 times for people to hear it. But latest research says that's not really true anymore. There's no magic number. Here's what the magic is. People hear it as noise until they need to know it. People hear it as noise until they need to know it. So if you're in Indiana 3 weeks ago when they were talking about behavior change, modification, or masks, 3 or 4 weeks ago, you might not have thought that was critical. Or where to go to get a test, you might not have thought that was critical. But if someone in your family member is showing signs of the coronavirus, you now need to know where to go get a test. Now you're going to listen differently because it's important to you. So this is why the consistency matters. Even at Pacer Sports and Entertainment, a sporting company, we're a sport franchise. Every day at 11 o'clock, we have an executive phone call to talk about what the issues are. Every week, we have an employee all hands meeting. 265 people jump on a Zoom call. Consistency of message. Why do we do that? It eliminates a question. We address things in real time, and it gives people comfort. Some of this is also that comfort factor of our leaders are still there. We're still focused on it every minute of every day. And the consistency gives you the chance to change the behavior of your audience so they know what they can count on is you talking to them at a certain time every day, if that's what the crisis requires. So you got to be coordinated across all your message platforms, coordinated with your spokespeople. You have to be consistent in your timing of how you communicate. And then finally, you need to be compassionate. You won't find this in a lot of textbooks, I'll be honest with you, but it is key to critical communication. You have to understand your audience. You've got to talk directly to the people that are being impacted by the crisis. And then you have to convey your support and your sympathy. Early on, I've been a Red Cross volunteer. It's hard to believe I've been a Red Cross volunteer for 40 years. And I love the Red Cross because there's not a more compassionate organization, and they always show up in crisis. I was volunteering at a fire up in California, up in the mountains of California, the beautiful area of California, multi-million-dollar homes disintegrated because of a fire. And I went with Red Cross to volunteer. And as I was out there in the ashes with the people who've lost their homes, I heard a man yell, I found it. And of course I went over because I was curious, what did he find? And he held up his hands, and through his hands, ashes sifted through the fingers, but was left in the palm of his hands were quarters, nickels, and dimes. And he looked at my face, and he could see I was perplexed why he was so thrilled about finding loose change. And he goes, he said, this is where my wife and I kept our loose change bucket, right inside our doorway. He said, and I found it. And I just paused, trying to reflect on what was happening. He said, oh, you don't understand. for every coin I find, I'm a victor, not a victim. I'm a victor, not a victim. When I walk away from that moment, and I give Red Cross all the credit that they show up when people are in crisis, but I walked away from that moment and I thought that helped shape me as a Red Cross volunteer to understand what type of emotions and feelings people are having when they're going through a crisis. Apart from that, if you told me that story, I might scratch my head and say, why would a guy who lost a multi-million-dollar house care about quarters, nickels, and dimes? But the underlying message is that he wanted to be a victor. You only understand that as a communicator if you spend time with people who are impacted by a crisis and by a disaster. And so that is important when you're designing crisis communication plans. You can all day long put good thoughts and ideas and bubble charts and scope things out on paper. But until you get out and you visit with and meet people who are impacted by the crisis, your plan, your communication will fall short. And so I encourage people to think of those 3 C's: coordinate your work, be consistent in your communication, and be compassionate in all that you do around crisis communication. Thanks, Janet.
Thanks, Allison. And I think we'll shift to Jennifer now.
Great. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Janet. And thank you, Allison. I think a lot of what you are about to hear in my presentation will echo the 3 C's. Everything that Allison said is 100% spot on, and especially that last point: compassion, compassion, compassion. Because you don't know what people are going through at all in our daily lives, but especially in times of a crisis. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully, we'll see here. Share that, and let me get my presentation started. Unfortunately, I do mine in not PowerPoint, and I can't get it to work. Hang on 1 second. I should have practiced earlier. You were right. Let me stop my sharing. Go back to that. All right, I am struggling here. I apologize. I also apologize, Allison, I will disagree ever so slightly on the first grade comment, because the crisis I was mitigating right before this was a 12-year-old and a 7-year-old who could not agree on playing Fortnite. So it was a bit of a problem. Okay, I'm not able to do that. I'm so sorry.
Allison, would you like me to share your slides for you?
If you wouldn't mind, I'm having trouble getting into presenter mode and then getting back into Zoom.
Sure.
Thank you. So as that is miraculously happening, my technology fail, I do just want to say a few words about my background. Thank you, Janet, for that introduction. I did start out as a reporter, and I've had a lot of different experiences as a communicator. The 2 I'm going to focus in on today are my time at the National Nuclear Security Administration, and then my time working with the IPS School Board. Those are both some case studies that I can share that illustrate the 4 questions that I try to ask thank you so much, as we go through a crisis. If you could go ahead and go to that first slide, that would be awesome. Thank you. So again, you're going to hear a lot of the same themes that Allison presented in this presentation. But the big thing I try to tell folks is, obviously you need to have a plan. Going into any organization, any campaign, you have to have a plan for what is going to go wrong, but you absolutely can't prepare for everything that is going to go wrong, because you just don't know. 9/11 is an example of that. Who would have thought 6 weeks ago that our entire state would be shut down by a tiny little spiky virus that we can't predict, and we don't know where it's going next? So crisis response is a lot easier if you're prepared and you have someone you can call to help. And again, to echo that collaboration sentiment, the person that you want to have in charge of this is someone who has to be able to work with others. It may not be the smartest person in the room, it may not be the general, it may not be the lawyer, but it has to be someone who can take all that incoming and syndicate it. Again, developing a plan can take into account most, but not all possible crises. And today I'm going to present to you the 4 questions that I like to ask folks as you plan for the worst. Go to the next slide. So the number 1 question in any crisis is, how can you make people feel safe? And a lot of that echoes what Allison said about compassion and understanding in the moment and that consistent message. But if you can't get to the bottom 2 areas of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I'm sharing on the screen right now, safety and security, if you can't get to that point, you can't get to anything else. So that number 1 question is, how do you make people feel safe? You've got to identify the audience or audiences, what they might fear, and how you would want to be comforted and how they would want to be comforted, and to understand that you may be talking to multiple audiences. We could go to the next slide. So this is a quick case study that I mentioned in my time working at the National Nuclear Security Administration, which is the federal agency no one's ever heard of. It lives in the US Department of Energy. Its main client is the Department of Defense. And it does all the non-proliferation work around the world, so the really happy stuff. And it does all the really scary stuff, which is making sure our nuclear weapons stockpile is able to function if we needed it to, and then taking all of the old weapons offline that we no longer need, that have been taken out of inventory, and making them into harmless pieces of metal and nuclear material. So that work, that latter work, is all done at a place called Pantex, which is located in Amarillo, Texas. It is located in the middle of nowhere because you want to be able to see what might be coming from all directions. And so one day when I was at NNSA, I came into work in the morning and our phone started ringing off the hook. CNN, CBS, ABC, all of the networks calling us with reports that Pantex was in lockdown, which we knew, but that there were 2 guys roaming around the perimeter of the facility dressed in camo with long guns. And at that point, we had no idea what was going on. You can see from this headline the punchline of the story, but we didn't know what was happening. And so we had to really quickly figure out, coordinating a response, which was made even harder because all of these facilities, and this is true across the federal government, are what's called government-owned, contractor-operated. So you are not just dealing with 1 set of communicators at the local level, you are dealing with 2, and they have different competing interests. One is there to make sure taxpayer money is spent efficiently, to report back up to the federal agency. The other is there to make the facility look good because they want to get their contract renewed. So even among your communicators, you've got differing interests. So, at that point, we had to identify our audiences and what they would want to feel at that point. And our main concern, of course, was the residents of Amarillo, Texas, who have this massive nuclear weapons facility in their backyard. And maybe there's some people that are trying to do bad things right outside of it. So if we could go forward 1 slide. So residents of Amarillo who might be concerned, workers and staff at Pantex, audiences that might be concerned about their safety, folks across the nuclear weapons complex and national defense officials, and of course, you've got the general public watching this live. They've never heard of Pantex, and all they're getting is word that our nuclear weapons could be at risk. So obviously, the punchline of the story is that this was 2 guys who worked at Pantex who forgot to tell their supervisor they wanted to go duck hunting over their lunch break. They just forgot, right? So once we found that out, this was a pretty quick resolution to the story. We were able to tie it all up, put it to bed. And I actually never did follow up to find out what happened to those 2 gentlemen because it was better off not knowing. But that was what happened. So this massive thing that could have been a major national security issue turned out to be 2 guys who forgot to tell their boss they were going to go duck hunting. But in that moment, we didn't know that. So if we could go forward to the next slide. So the second question you have to ask in a crisis is, what actions are you taking to prevent harm? And that's an immediate response. So in this case, we had to quickly communicate that everything was safe. Obviously, Pantex has hundreds more armed guards inside, so the immediate threat probably wasn't as grave as CNN was portraying it. But then we have to also consider a long-term response. What actions are we taking to prevent that from happening again? Let's double down and make sure that people are telling their supervisors what they're doing, possibly bringing in some punitive actions if they don't. And then this consistency, echoing what Allison said, you have to be consistent over and over. When I worked in politics, I would tell the candidates that I worked with and the elected officials, listen, if you're not dreaming it, if you're not saying it so many times it's showing up in your subconscious, you're not doing it right. Because it's only barely starting to penetrate with the public as you're getting sick of saying it. I do want to emphasize this whole need to know messaging, and this is a very tricky area. People don't need to know everything. There's a fine line between transparency and overly scaring people. And you have to have, again, going back to that first point, the right folks in the room who can kind of gut check you and make sure that you are putting the information out there that people really do truly need to know. This is a big one for me, this fourth bullet. Being right is better than being first. As Allison said, you've got your core spokespeople that you've identified, and they are going to be delivering the message on your behalf. There are going to be a million other people talking. In this day and age, everybody's a reporter. You know, back when I covered 9/11 as a little baby 21-year-old reporter, people had to turn to the national news. They had to turn to newspapers to get most of their coverage. Now they just flip on Twitter and people make stuff up. So it's even more important in a crisis that your information is accurate. And that doesn't mean getting out there and swinging at every pitch that people are throwing on social media. It's a-okay to say, hey, we're still gathering information. We'll be back to you at, you know, tomorrow's 2:30 briefing. If you could advance the slide, please. So the third question is, how are you going to communicate your response? Again, consistency is everything. And whatever platforms you choose to use, social, earned media, if you follow up your crisis with a paid media response, whatever spokesperson or spokespeople you choose, this is not the time to A/B test your response. This is where communications advice differs wildly from a non-crisis time to a crisis time. So, with my clients, we run a lot of Facebook ads. We test out a lot of messages to see what's most effective. This is not the time to do that. And this is the area, this third bullet of how you communicate, that you can plan the most for. You can put a robust plan in place. You can get those people identified. You can have that team ready to go at the blink of an eye whenever something happens in advance. And this is where I would have you focus most of your efforts as you pull together a communications plan. If we could advance, please. The fourth question is, what are you doing to make sure this never happens again? This is both an immediate response, but also a long-term response. You see a lot of major companies that have created self-inflicted crises, whether it's, oil spills or other types of disasters that could be avoided. After the fact, they usually spend a lot of money trying to repair their reputation, trying to make it clear how they're never going to have this terrible thing happen again. That's because trust is earned over time and broken in an instant. And I mentioned my 2 kids earlier, and I tell them that all the time. You can be perfect every single day and take 1 cookie out of the cookie jar, and I'm not going to trust you not to do it. Same is true for corporate and organizational reputation management. But the second bullet here, this is an opportunity for self-reflection, not self-defense. This one is incredibly difficult. And the example I'll close with is a great one to illustrate this. There's a fine line between protecting your reputation, i.e. making sure that people understand that you're still there, you're still in business, or you're still committed to your mission, and then hunkering down and being incredibly defensive. So if we could go forward 1 slide. So I mentioned I worked with the Indianapolis Public School Board as a client, and it was great. I mean, they are doing yeoman's work. This is a $300 million business enterprise, and the school board was my client. So these are the folks that are elected to oversee that enterprise, that spending, but they are not the same as the district. And so, one day in 2016, the absolute worst thing possible that I think could happen in a school happened. And look, all of this stuff is out of your control, because you trust these folks with students, you do your best to vet them, but sometimes people do bad things, bad people slip through the cracks. So this story was an IPS counselor who was involved sexually with 2 underage students. Even if they weren't underage, it would still be illegal. And the story broke. This was at a time when the superintendent was being interviewed for other jobs in other districts. So there's a lot of political sensitivity around this. And the initial response that some of the school board members wanted to give, and it's a completely natural one, was they wanted to go out and have a press conference and talk about how great the response was, how, you know, the superintendent did the right thing, et cetera, and so forth. The problem was we didn't know that. We actually had no idea. There were a couple of pieces of the puzzle that were literally missing. A laptop, there were some other questions that hadn't been answered. And the biggest one was what's highlighted here. We didn't know if the school actually did the right thing. Under state law, they are required to report any sort of incident like this within a 24-hour time frame. And you can see from this slide that the incident was reported to the school on February 17th, and it was 6 days later before the Department of Child Services got the report from the school. So this is one where being able to talk them off the ledge, if you will, and say, look, guys, I understand your gut instinct is to defend the district, to defend the superintendent, to defend yourselves because you're elected and because you want to get reelected, presumably, but we can't do that. And, you know, it was a hard conversation to have. We didn't have that press conference. All of this information came out afterward, and we were able to respond in a more calm, meaningful way. And then to go forth and explain to folks, the audiences that are most impacted by this, how that was never going to happen again, or the steps that were going to be taken. And that was a really tough situation to have. So if we could go forward one more. I just want to wrap up by, you know, reiterating all of the 4 questions, everything that Allison said. Tips, tricks, and strategies, these are really just, you know, a lot of what was already discussed, but identifying the folks you trust to be part of the response and making it really clear to everyone involved in your organization that they are the team and they are in charge. You're not going to be able to prevent people from leaking things out. You're not going to be able to prevent people from tweeting their various hypotheses about what is happening in a time of crisis, but you can make it clear who the actual responders are. Write up a plan in advance. Accept the unknown. So if you're someone who has a high level of anxiety, probably not going to be on the crisis communications team, because it's impossible to know what's going to happen next. Take yourself out of the situation so you can make objective decisions, or have someone who can do that for you. And then monitor that incoming activity. I have a client, you know, who, you know, they look at everything on Twitter. Absolutely, they flag things. There are a lot of great platforms out there that allow you to do that, but you cannot let that drive your response to a crisis. You have to make the best choices based on your plan, not on what others are saying. Monitor that, take it in stride, but stick to your guns. So that's all I have prepared, and I can see that there's at least one comment, so if we want to switch back. And thank you again for saving me on the technology.
No problem. All right. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer. And thank you, Allison, for those really great presentations. We do have one question that's come in, so we'll start there. But before we get there, I'll remind everyone that we do have the availability to have you ask your own questions if you'd like to unmute yourself for a moment to pose a question. And then you're also welcome to enter a question into the chat function. So the first question is from Michael, and he asks, I'd like to hear from both of our experts on their opinions about how effectively our federal COVID crisis team, in particular our communicator-in-chief, President Trump, has handled Allison's 3 C's during the crisis.
I'll jump in on that, and Janet, with her political background, I'd be curious to hear your answer too. I think our federal government, I'm going to answer this in two ways. How have they handled the communication separate from how they've handled the crisis? So remember, anytime there's a crisis, you get just a short window of time to talk about what the crisis is before all of a sudden you get the friction that's so important of people questioning, did you prepare? Were you ready? Did we know more? Should our test? Like that is a friction that we have a luxury of in this country, that we get to challenge and question authority in a way to try and get to resolution faster. So that's a whole different bucket of questions around how is the federal government handled this. But when we talk about the 3 C's, that they can be put it against that rubric, that the coordination, from what I have seen, I think President Trump almost in an unprecedented way has relied on experts to deal with these issues, and has been open and willing to let the experts carry the direction and the strategy. So that's maybe to be, sure, that's probably not what a typical behavior of a president to say, okay, let me turn over to the doctors, to the experts, to the scientists. And so I think from a coordinated approach, that's been done very well. I think from a consistency approach, I think they've built in a drumbeat that has been very reliable of providing information as it comes and as they know it. And then from being compassionate, I think that you have found a deeper level of compassion, in my opinion, across some of the other spokespeople that the president has put around him. And so that's a strong strategy too. People should, if you've read any of the work by Gallup, talking about playing to your strengths, knowing who you are, knowing what your role is, but then surrounding yourself with people that might be additive to that component. And so I think from what we've watched happen, it's been unprecedented and maybe better than some might expect. But it's a tough position to be in when you're trying to cast a vision for strength and a future and getting the country back on track, and still at the same time dealing with this terrible situation.
Yeah, and I think obviously there are political overtones to everything these days, and I think we're going to spend a lot of time on the 4th question in my presentation of, how do we make sure this never happens again? And that's going to be something that, politicians and elected officials debate after this is over. It's interesting. I also do political commentary for our Fox and CBS affiliates here, so we've talked a lot about this in recent weeks. And I'm a Democrat, but my partner is a conservative Republican, so we talk a lot about this around the dinner table. The interesting thing about it is almost this strange communications coalition that you have the president who has his base, and he communicates with them in a very different way than I think a lot of people communicate, but it works for him. He's got, to Allison's point, this, coalition of medical professionals around him, and you've got Democrats who trust those folks who are listening. And you've got, states, obviously this is trickled down to the states and governors who are delivering their message to their folks, and it's working. It's this weird, consistent message with so many different messengers that would probably never be in the room together, would never be communicating together, but it's working because they're all communicating to their audiences in ways that are effective. So, echoing what Allison said, it is working, but it is working in a way that I don't think anyone who works in our line of work could have predicted.
All right, well, thanks for those comments. Certainly, this has been a really difficult thing to respond to, and we're seeing great examples around the country and not so great examples, but we can always learn and improve for the next time, as you were saying, so we try to prevent this all from happening again. We had one more question come in from Julie, and she asks or says, I work in a municipal government and we are working with a constituency who says they do not feel safe. She appreciates how important it is it is represented in Jennifer's graphic, but she wonders how best to try to connect with a population who has a different perspective of safety.
That's a really good question. And I think this may sound, it's not meant to be cliche, but I mean, to me, if you've got a community that's communicating with you that says, we don't feel safe, you have to ask more questions. I mean, you have to go out and communicate with them, and perhaps over communicate with them. In a municipal setting, I you have a lot of opportunities to do that if you can get them to a place where they are comfortable talking with you about the why. Because you can't solve a safety problem if you don't understand the fear. What fear is driving your lack of security, and then you can make policy changes, or take a stand in a way that will help address that underlying fear. I think oftentimes people think that there is a way to communicate that is somehow special, this silver bullet out there that is going to solve all of the problems, when the thing that is actually needed most is just direct communication with the affected constituency.
Reminds me a little bit of that quote from Theodore Roosevelt. He said, people won't care about how much you know until they know how much you care. And it would be interesting to know what it would take for that person to feel safe. And then part of it is you have to accept that you may or may not be able to deliver on that for them. And that's one of the hardest things about leadership, is that you can't always help everyone. And that's the heartbreak of leading and governing. But if you knew what it would take for them to feel safe, it would be a good start.
And if I can add one more thing in there too, I think a lot of times, and this goes back to the whole spokesperson messenger conversation that happens in every communications plan, regardless of whether it's a crisis or not, is, are the right people talking to that constituency? I still work in the education sphere, and a lot of the folks who are well-meaning in that sphere, they look like me, right? And they live pretty privileged lives, and their kids are not suffering. And so for me to go out and talk about K-12 education may not be the right thing. So going out and finding messengers in that community who are trusted leaders, whether they're faith leaders or just community leaders, they could be teachers, they could be principals, whoever it is, but people who can actually feel that same lack of security and make that bridge between the community that's affected and the leaders. It's a hard conversation to have sometimes, because it doesn't matter. A good heart doesn't know the color of your skin or your background, but I can have the best heart in the world, but if I go out and try to talk to a group of low-income African-American moms who are frustrated with their school, that's not going to work. So messengers matter.
See, we also had a question come in from Janet. Janet, did you want to vocalize that, or should I do that on your behalf?
I guess I can say my own question. What I wanted to observe is that, of course, this type of situation is very different from any other sorts of crisis communication. It affects everybody. It's a situation where we are trying to get people to behave in certain ways. Not every crisis would involve that. But I also think it must be challenging for local governments in particular, because there's so much communication and messaging coming from the federal government and from the state government. And the city governments are in many ways relying on not only those messages, but also information that may be being collected by agencies in the hierarchy above them. So I wonder if you have any observations or advice for city officials of how they handle communications in a situation where there's so much going on above them that they are dependent on.
I wrote a piece, I guess last week, and the original title was "Lead, Follow, or Get Out of the Way." Maybe you've heard that saying before, like, come on, lead, follow, or get out of the way. But then I kept working on it, and I landed on lead, follow, or support. I find that when you're in a situation of this magnitude, to your point, Jen, that every unprecedented in our lifetime, that every single person is impacted by the same crisis at different levels, but we're all impacted by it. That some of us, that it's important to figure out what your role is. So if you're sometimes you're going to be in a position where you need to lead your team, your group, your company, your city, your town. Sometimes you'll have to follow. If you're a small, you run in town, you're going to have to follow the mayor, and the mayor's got to follow the governor's got to follow the president. And then sometimes your role is just to support, because there are so many unknowns. And so I think is the successful leaders in politics and government, in companies and families, will be people who identify which role they're to play in which situation: lead, follow, or support. And then also to stay optimistic in that, you know, you can only deal with the facts that you have. In crisis communication, you know, it's kind of a rule of thumb. First reports are always wrong. You just kind of accept it. Whatever that first report is, it's going to be wrong. And we can even see that. You know, I remember the press conferences 3 weeks ago, and Dr. Kane is showing everybody how to elbow bump. And we thought, okay, that's our new normal, is we're elbow bumping. And now what do we know? Oh gosh, we can't even be within elbow reach of each other. So you have to stay optimistic, and you have to adapt. Thomas Friedman talks about the people who succeed, author Thomas Friedman, New York Times columnist. The people who succeed in life are the people who can adapt to their changing situation and circumstances. I think it is frustrating for leaders, because people who go into roles of leadership typically are wired to be a problem solver. They want to fix the streets and the potholes and the trash pickup and education. They're motivated, they're passionate about problem solving. Yet we find ourselves all in the same situation, that this is not a problem. We can sketch out a plan and work toward it for immediate success or results, because the circumstances continue to evolve and change. So I do think that the adaptability is key, optimism is essential, and then figuring out your role in each scenario of, do you lead, do you follow, or is your role to support?
And I would add one thing to that amazing summary, which is you have to be able to do that without blaming the other entities that are playing in the roles that they're playing. And that can be really difficult, because there is, you know, politics is in everything. It was remarkable to see yesterday, you know, Mayor Hogsett, Mayor Henry, alongside Governor Holcomb, delivering that same message. But that's not always going to be the case. And I think especially for those who are at the municipal level and who don't necessarily have the support of a major urban area like Indianapolis or Fort Wayne or Evansville, it's more difficult to say, we just don't know yet, we're working on it, than it is to say, oh yeah, well, I just don't have that from the state yet, or oh, the feds, they've messed up the rollout of the SBA loan program. It's really hard, because we as human beings also want to be able to feel useful, feel like we're doing something, and when you can't because you don't have the information, or the information isn't right, it's a hard thing to set aside our tendency to want someone to be held accountable for that. But I think that's really more important now than ever as we deal with this crisis.
I think that's a really good message. And I think, just speaking from my personal observations of what's been going on with this one, I think we've seen examples, many, where things are handled well or poorly. And unfortunately, a lot of the story has become about the way things are being communicated. And there has been something of a battle between the federal government and the states that's been launched. I think that I think if I were a New Yorker, and I have my brother and sister-in-law live in New York, and they haven't been outside their apartment in 3 weeks, I think they'd feel pretty comforted by how much Governor Cuomo is behaving like he is sticking up for them, and that his top priority is protecting New Yorkers, even if he has to say hard things in public. And I think he's doing really a pretty good job. I'd also agree that I think Governor Holcomb is doing a great job. Part of it is being calm. That's one of the lessons I learned from my years in government, is the press secretary you want is the press secretary who does not turn everything into drama, and in fact is very calm. And I think calm communication is really key. So I want to thank you guys again. We're just up on the hour. This has been very informative to me. I really, you guys are communicators, right? So you've done a really good job of communicating about communicating, and the 3 C's and the 4 points. It's all that, those kinds of things can stick in our minds. So please feel free to email us if you have any thoughts or comments about this. Feel free to let others know that this will be available on archive. Please do come back and join us. I think in May, it will be a great time to talk about how this experience relates to all the discussions and the work that everybody's doing to anticipate and prepare for climate change. Because it may be on a little bit slower time frame, but there are a lot of similarities with what we're facing now and the kinds of things that people will be facing in maybe just a couple of years from now. So, Andrea, any last words?
I just want to say a special thanks to all of our public servants out there who are doing this work right now. It's really important, and we'll certainly need your expertise as we go into the future.
Hear, hear. And everybody, please stay safe, be careful, no elbow bumping. And we'll see each other on Zoom, and then we'll see each other on the other side of this. Take care, everybody.